As we said earlier, it's a very personal psalm written by David from personal experience. And as we read earlier, and I referred to Laura's Bible, where she's written in red her own name in the appropriate places. It is a psalm that every time we sing it, every time we hear it read, or we read it ourselves, it is so, so personal. And it's a wonderful psalm. There are no references to we or us or they, but only reference to my and me and I and you, as David speaks about a very personal trust and relationship in the Lord Jesus Christ. It's a very personal psalm. It's David's testimony. It's his personal experience with God. But it also becomes very precious to you and to me. It's a beautiful psalm, speaking of green pastures, still waters, but also being very honest about life, because it also speaks about dark valleys and enemies and adversaries. So it's a beautiful personal psalm, and David intends us to take it that way. It's almost as if David's saying, no, just pause for a while. Here's a psalm, as many of his psalms, here's a psalm he says that I want you to really think about and pray about and meditate on, because it's my testimony. David had a very difficult experience in his life and his following of God and his obedience to God. It was a very, very trying and difficult time. We didn't cover in the introduction the fact that there were many years when David had to literally run in fear of losing his own life because of things that were happening. And he could have lost his life because Saul didn't like this young usurping upstart of a youngster taking this attitude that one day he would replace Saul on the throne and would rule over Israel. And Saul didn't want that. So Saul set about making sure that he put every obstacle possible in the way of David. And he would have had him killed by the sword. So David had to hide in the caves and in the rocks during daylight hours in fear of Saul's army catching him. But also then he had to run and move on under the cover of darkness. So it was a very difficult time for David. We did reference his personal sin. We did reference his sin by committing adultery with Bathsheba, and then to try and cover his tracks, he tried to have Bathsheba's husband put to death by the sword by putting at the front of the army on the sort of front line of the battle, believing that the enemy would do David a favor. So there were many dark spots, many sort of troughs and deep valleys in David's life. But nevertheless, he can share with us this personal word of testimony. And there are a few things we can observe in David's testimony. Number one is this, that God again and again and again proved to be the one who brings comfort when David was in a time of need. And David really believes that about God. This is not poetic exaggeration. This is not David trying to write a best-selling novel or to win the poetry competition. It's not fictitious. It's not exaggerated in any way. It is deeply theological and personal as to David's own walk with God, because David experienced the presence of God and the help of God and the love of God in so many different ways. David heard the voice of God speaking to him in those quiet times. David followed the lead that God gave him time and time again. And when things were difficult and he was walking through the valley, the shadow of death, he felt God's real care and concern for him. And he shares that in so many of his psalms. Another psalm that I particularly love reading and thinking about is Psalm 37. And again, despite all of David's sufferings and all of David's difficulties, nevertheless, in Psalm 37, David says, I learned, even in the most challenging of times, to put my trust in God. He also says in that psalm that even when the enemy was seeking him out and tried to put him to death, he could delight in the goodness of God. He could rejoice in the goodness of God towards him. And he could also say, very much so, that even when he walked through the valley of the shadow of death, he would fear no evil in Psalm 23, but he knew that his shepherd was by his side. So it was a very personal time for David that expressed in Psalm 23. You'll notice that David refers to God in the psalm in the third person. The Lord's my shepherd. He makes me to lie down. He leads me and he restores my soul. Then in verses 4 and 5 of Psalm 23, he then begins to address God in the second person. I will fear no evil because you're with me. Your rod and your staff, it is they that will comfort me. And you prepare a table before me, even in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. And then he says, surely goodness and mercy and love will follow me all the days of my life, because I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. He speaks of the valley experiences that he walked through. He speaks of the shadows closing in upon him. He describes in this psalm the crisis points of his life, but yet even in those times, there was something deep going on in his relationship with God. And I suppose you and I are prone to, very often, we can talk about God, can't we? We can talk about the green pastures because they're there in the psalm. But what we need to do is to talk to God, not just talk about God. But David's example is that we talk to God. He's my shepherd. He's the one who cares for me. He's the one who watches over me. And even though, like the sheep, I'm prone to wander off into the distance in pursuit of greener grass somewhere else, because the grass is always greener on the other side, yet he is with me. And in the dark, we can hold on to God. We can hug God because he embraces us with his love and his mercy. And that was very, very personal for David to know that God was always with him. It's also helpful to realize that God allows times in the valley. God doesn't promise us a life of great, abundant blessing with no problems, with his joy and celebration every day of our lives, because nothing ever happens in our life as a Christian that can bring us down. We almost can be tempted to think that we should be living in a bubble. But what we're reminded about in this psalm is that God does sometimes take us through the valley experience. In the first 4 verses of Psalm 23, David takes the gentle picture of a shepherd watching over his sheep to describe the relationship that God has with you and with me, because God was with David and he speaks personally about that. And when we go through those valley experiences, and we've mentioned some of those experiences tonight, there's those valley experiences of ill health. And we've been praying for Ruth with the recent diagnosis of cancer. We've been praying for Heather and for Anne and the difficult situation that Anne and Heather find themselves in, walking through those valleys of the shadow of death. But yet we can, with David, say, I fear no evil because my shepherd is with me. We've been listening and sharing with Norman the concerns that Norman has at this present time for the young people he has responsibility for, but also that cloud over his own head, that his own employment might be affected by decisions of others, decisions that don't make sense. We do walk through those dark valleys of experience sometimes. And it was a dangerous situation. David really did find himself in a very dangerous situation with Saul's army in pursuit. His life at times was in jeopardy. And if it wasn't for the fact that he knew his shepherd was by his side and watching over him, then he would have bowed under the pressure. And that's a very important lesson for you and I to remember and to take on board for ourselves, isn't it? That sometimes we can't find the answers. There are no answers that we can find. There are no solutions that are just around the corner, and we can reach out and we can grab them and hold on to them. Sometimes it is very difficult and challenging and hurtful and concerning for us as we walk through those shadows of the valley of death. But the wonderful thing about a shepherd in Israel, in those days and today, as we've mentioned previously, the thing about a shepherd is they just didn't put the sheep in the field and then go and spend the rest of the night in the comfort of the farmhouse, watching a colour television and drinking coffee and eating wonderful meals whilst the sheep were fending for themselves in the field. No, there were so many dangers, so many enemies, so many other animals that could so easily take the life of the sheep, weather conditions, all manner of things. The shepherd would live with the sheep. And when he had to go for rest, he'd make sure that a substitute was there instead, to make sure the sheep were cared for day after day after day. But with our Lord, with our shepherd, who of course we know as Jesus, who describes himself as the shepherd of his sheep, he doesn't leave it to somebody else whilst he takes a rest. He's with us 24/7. He's with us constantly, providing for us, watching over us, protecting us, and making sure that we're not in any danger and protecting us from the evil one. And this was the wonderful lesson that David is sharing with us in his personal psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. In him I will put my trust. And as we think of Jesus as our good shepherd, a good shepherd who had laid down his life for his sheep, a shepherd who would lead a lamb into the valley filled with danger and death threats, a shepherd who would be prepared to leave 99 of his 100 sheep safely in the fold whilst he went and risked his own life onto the mountainside to rescue just one sheep. That was the care, the concern, the love, the compassion that he had for the flock under his care. And that was the lesson that David learned time and time again. There's a really beautiful book based on the teaching and the words of Psalm 23, written by an Australian shepherd. His name was Philip Keller. And it's well worth getting hold of the copy of that book, A Shepherd's Look at Psalm 23. And this is something that Philip Keller observed as he read through that psalm. He says this in his book: "The shepherd knows from past experience that predators like coyotes, bears, wolves, cougars can take cover in these broken cliffs and from that vantage point prey upon the flock that the shepherd has care for. The shepherd knows that these valleys can be subject to sudden storms and flash floods that will send walls of water rampaging down the slopes. There could be rock slides, mudslides, or a dozen other natural disasters that would destroy, injure, and maim his sheep. But in spite of such hazards, he also knows that this is still the best way to take care of his flock, to get them to the high country. He spares himself no pains, no trouble, no time, in order to keep an eye out for any danger that might develop." And we might ask the question, well, why did David have to walk through those valleys of the shadow of death? Why did he have to face those dangers? Wasn't there a shortcut? Wasn't the way that the shepherd could find a way round the rocks and the animals that were preying upon his sheep? Wasn't there an easier route that he could have taken his sheep? No, is the answer. The only way to the higher ground, the only way to the safe ground, the only way to the green pasture and to the blessings was by going through the landslides, the rock slides, and the dozen other natural disasters that could overtake his sheep. And Psalm 23 teaches us that your shepherd has appointed even the hard times as one of his paths of righteousness. He may lead you through the valley for reasons that probably won't be apparent at the time, and we can't work it out what God is doing. But we can rest assured he's taking you to the high country. He's going to take you to the place where the sun is warm. He's going to take you to the place where the grass is greener, lush, and good for you. And every valley becomes a pathway to something better. And that's the wonderful experience that David had in his life. And that experience that David shares in his psalm, in Psalm 23, with you and with me. The Lord taking us to the higher ground. In Psalm 84 and verse 11, it says this: "No good does the Lord withhold from those who walk uprightly." Or as Paul puts it in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, "We know that all things work together for good for those who love God. Those are called according to his purpose." The valley isn't good, but the shepherd is good, and the shepherd knows the way. So the other lesson that David learned and shares with us in Psalm 23 is the shepherd has you covered. He has your back, as we might say. David tells us how to be fearless, even in the face of adversity. He tells us that even in the valley of the shadow of death, he didn't dread the distress he would face, or he didn't cringe in the face of crisis. So how do I fight our fears? How do we work things out when we don't know what's going to happen next? When we can't even begin to imagine what's going to become of us because our fears and our mind become working overtime. Well, the question we can ask David is this: how, David, did you do it? And tells us that his confidence came in 3 ways described to us in Psalm 23. In verse 4, David says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Why? Because you're with me. It's your rod, it's your staff, it's they that comfort me. So first of all, David speaks of God's nearness, God's presence. So when you step into the valley, into your personal valley in your Christian walk, and it's so dark, you can't even see the path ahead, and you face the possibility that there may be predators waiting for you and enemies lying in wait, your shepherd has something he wants you to hear. I'll be with you, and all you need is to have the shepherd by your side. So when you step into your valley, we know the shepherd is by our side. I remember giving a talk at the youth meeting in Wigan many, many decades ago now. And we had a brother and a sister who came along to the Friday night youth meeting. And they lived in a part of the Wigan area where the church was based. It had no street lighting. They lived in a farmhouse that was right at the end of a very dark pathway, a very dark approach road to the farm. No lights whatsoever. And that reminded me when I was sharing with them this particular psalm, Psalm 23, that, what do you do if you're stepping out of the brightness of the farmhouse and you're making your way to the main road along a dark path? What's the best thing to do? Well, it's to take a light with you, isn't it? And to shine the light so you can see what's ahead of you, to avoid the potholes, to avoid the puddles, and you can see your destination ahead of you so much more clearly. And that is David's experience and what he shares with us here. He speaks of God's nearness. In Hebrews chapter 13 and in verses 5 and 6, we read this: "I will never leave you or forsake you." And if we take that promise in Hebrews to our hearts, then we can with confidence say, yes, God is my helper, my shepherd, my friend. So why should I fear? Because what can man do to me? Now, of course, the writer to the Hebrews was writing to persecuted Christians. There were Jews who had become Christians, they'd been converted, but because of their newfound faith in Jesus Christ, they would be hounded from their homes. They weren't welcome in their village anymore. They'd lost their employment, their livelihood, and they had to be on the move through the wilderness and find peace and tranquility and fellowship with like-minded believers. And it was a very, very hard and difficult step to take. When I worked with Grace Baptist Mission, I spent a total of 6 weeks in India, 2 3-week visits, or maybe it was longer than 3 weeks, to South India. And we met some very, very brave pastors of churches in the villages. And there was one pastor who had to flee for his life because he was preaching the gospel, and the elders of the community, the Hindu community in the village, didn't like it and tried to arrest him, have him put into prison and face a death penalty. And it was a very, very hard and difficult time for him and for the family. But I remember that pastor quoting us the words of Psalm 23. So would you rather I leave the... Right, and this is what Philip Keller went on to say in his book. Okay, he's putting the children to bed at night, and they're fearful of the dark. Okay, so what do you want me to do? He would ask them. Do I leave the light on and then go downstairs? Or do I turn the light off and stay with you for a while? What do you think the children chose to happen? Dad to turn the light off, but to stay in the dark bedroom with them, because he was their protector. He was their guide. He was the one who would provide for them. And that's the wonderful, wonderful experience that we have, even though we might walk through those valley experiences. You also saw God's power in Psalm 23. He references the shepherd's rod. Now, this would be a 2-foot club made of solid oak wood with a rounded head that was whittled with the knot of the tree and had sharp bits of metal pounded into it. It was a vicious weapon that the shepherd had in his possession. And why did he have the club? Because he would use it to defend his flock against the attacks of the enemy. And that pictures the power of the shepherd wielding this great weapon against the enemy, overpowering the enemy. So David could say he had no fear in adversity because of the comfort of God's power, the protection of the shepherd. And in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 4, we read, "Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world." But David also experienced God's leading, because not only does he refer to the shepherd's club, but he refers to the shepherd's staff. And it's your staff that brings comfort to me, referring to the shepherd's crook with its hook at one end. And a good shepherd would use his crook, his staff, to guide the sheep if they were to go astray. Just a gentle tap of the staff on the lamb's side would quickly move the sheep back into the fold and in line to listen and to follow the shepherd. But also that crook at the end of his staff he would use to gather up a sheep who'd fallen into a place of danger. And David in Psalm 23 speaks of being comforted by the shepherd's staff, the shepherd guarding his steps, the shepherd making sure that he makes it through the darkest valley and makes it safely. So in Psalm 23, David was supremely confident, not only about the present circumstances he was in, but of grace in the future that would see him all the way home to the glory of heaven. David believed and knew from personal experience that valley times were appointed for a good reason, because in the valley experiences, David learned things about God that couldn't be learned in any other situation, no other way. The only way he could learn some of those lessons was in the deep ravines of life. But he stayed close to the shepherd, and the shepherd stayed close to him. And David trusted in God's protection and God's guidance every step of the way in his life. And he could call God my shepherd. And we can look to Jesus and we can call him my shepherd, who laid down his life for the sheep. So just a brief